Rappers, welcome in to tonight's topic, which is a big one, and that is the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and the ensuing end of communism throughout Eastern Europe. I have a lot of notes, a lot of images to go alongside tonight's most important topic, which is a definite period 6 question waiting to happen on the AP exam and, of course, for the comprehensive exam moving forward. But let's just sort of get back to where we established as a principle of the Cold War, which is the Soviet Union was the superpower of the communist world. And the Soviet Union and the United States played a very dangerous game of the Cold War all throughout its entirety from the 1940s to the 1980s. And when you compare the Soviet Union to the United States, one area that I wanted to just briefly dive into is the space race. The Soviet Union and the United States competed against one another for supremacy in space. And in actuality, the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in many capacities in the space race. The Soviets had the first satellite in space, that would be Sputnik, and they also put the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin. And that was all ahead of the United States. The United States eventually won the space race by putting a man on the moon first, much to the chagrin of the Soviets. But ultimately, the space race was a defining characteristic of the Cold War, one in which the Soviets lost to the Americans. And that really is, in essence, a theme that we're going to perpetuate in the video tonight, which is how the Soviet Union, despite its efforts to keep up with America, could simply not best the United States in many of its Cold War struggles, including the nuclear arms race, or as it's often referred to as nuclear proliferation, is the growth and spread of nuclear arms. You'll notice on this very wonderful chart I have in front of you that the Soviet Union clearly produced more missiles than the United States. It also had more planes, long-range planes, than the United States. And there's no doubt that within the context of the Cold War, the growth of the nuclear arms race was a pivotal competition between the US and the Soviet Union. However, we've talked in previous classes about mutually assured destruction. So despite the competitiveness and the growth of nuclear proliferation in the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as other countries outside of these two also began to develop their own nuclear programs. Thankfully, no nuclear weapons were ever deployed in warfare following the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. But nonetheless, a point that I want to raise here about the decline of the Soviet Union's status as a world power and ultimately the fall of communism is the fact that in the Soviet Union, all this money and effort, economic effort, to sustain and keep up with the United States drained the Soviet economy tremendously. The chart that I have up right now gives you an idea of the Soviet Union's economic growth according to figures done by the Soviet Union in comparison to figures done by the United States as well as outside economic organizations. Clearly, whatever figure you're looking at, whether it's the Soviet Union projections or whether it's the United States projections, there's a downward trend. And that is really emblematic of the economic effects of communism, whether it's Stalin's 5-year plans, collectivism, trying to shift the economy over to industrialization. The Soviet Union's economy never was able to keep up with the United States. And consequently, when you're really looking for reasons why the Soviet Union began to fall, there's no doubt that part of the answer to that question really does have to do with the inability of the Soviet Union economy to maintain and keep up within the arms race, the nuclear arms race, as well as the space race. The Soviets just couldn't muster enough economic support to maintain that pace. So clearly, one of the downfalls of the Soviet Union does relate to its economic decline. But another reason, something else, reason number 2 for the Soviet Union's downfall, we're going to look at 3 key reasons today. So one is the economic decline. It just couldn't keep up economically. Number 2, we've got to look at the Soviet Union's ill-fated decision to invade the country of Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan, a country that was near the Soviet Union's borders in Central and South Asia. There was a communist uprising in Afghanistan, but the Soviet Union, as a result of this communist uprising, sent troops to support that uprising. However, the Soviets met incredibly stiff resistance from the local Afghan peoples fighting against communism, as well as immense international support from outside Muslim groups who came to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. One of those people, by the way, was Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden came to Afghanistan to fight on behalf of the Muslims there, struggling against communism. And this is actually where bin Laden's legend sort of began to grow. Bin Laden was a war hero fighting against the Soviets. And so after the war, that's what he used as his status to become more powerful, more popular in the Islamic world, and eventually in forming his terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda, which he formed with many people he had fought alongside with against the Soviets. Now, the United States of America heavily supported the Islamic fighters who fought against the Soviet Union, since in the Cold War, this was a great chance for the United States to win a proxy battle. If we could support the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters in Afghanistan, that gave the United States a chance to take down the Soviet Union. It was also a chance for America's President Jimmy Carter in 1980 to make a political statement involving sports. As a result of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, which was seen as an act of aggression, very similar, by the way, to the American invasion of Vietnam, if you look at a parallel there, the Soviet Union's invasion compelled many countries, and you can see the map here, including the U.S., to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The Olympic Games continued to be held in Moscow, but nonetheless, it was a stunning blow to the Soviet Union's sense of superiority, their sense of power. And as we've talked about throughout the year, sport as a vehicle for politics, this was a huge decision by Jimmy Carter to take the Americans out of the games. And Carter lobbied all over the world to gain support for this decision, which he received by many, many countries. In the end, the Afghan war lasted almost over a decade, and it was a stunning defeat for the Soviet Union. Much like America's loss to Vietnamese forces in the Vietnam War, it was a blow to Soviet confidence. No longer would the Soviet Union be considered this invincible superpower. Its armies were defeated in the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, as it's often nicknamed because no country had ever fully conquered Afghanistan, including the United States, which invaded Afghanistan after 9/11. So lesson learned there. Afghanistan is an almost impregnable place to wage a war, and the Soviet Union found out the hard way. Now, as a result of the Soviet Union's defeat in Afghanistan, that is a defining second cause of their empire's collapse. The Soviet Union just simply never recovered from the defeat in Afghanistan. However, back at home, there were major reforms going on in the Soviet Union. Reforms that brought the Soviet Union and the United States closer than ever before. In the 1980s, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan, you see the image of Gorbachev and Reagan shaking hands here. President Reagan and Gorbachev formed a close alliance in order to cool down the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's two defining words that I want to bring up here to help better understand what was going on in the Soviet Union in response to its empire starting to fall apart. The first term is Glastnost. Glastnost is considered to be like the opening up of the Soviet Union. More freedom of speech, more toleration towards the arts and journalism. Glastnost was a principle under Mikhail Gorbachev to create a more open and tolerant Soviet Union society. The other reform that occurred as the Soviet Union was beginning to collapse was known as Perestroika. And Perestroika was the economic liberalization of the Soviet Union, beginning to shift. And again, this was carried out through the reforms under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. Perestroika was predominantly a shift away from a communist planned economy, and it was a shift more towards economic liberalism, very similar to what Deng Xiaoping did in China. And remember, Deng Xiaoping was the leader after Mao who shifted China's economy towards more of a capitalist-style economy. Under Gorbachev and with perestroika reforms, the Soviet Union began to also shift its economy more towards capitalism. So it's very important that we see how in both major superpowers, communism ultimately economically failed, and with perestroika or Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China, ultimately the system of economic communism would be toppled, and both countries moved closer towards a system of economic capitalism. And the third and final moment of the Soviet Union's collapse had to do with all these factors combined. When you add up how the Soviet Union was no longer this invincible superpower, which was demonstrated in Afghanistan and their defeat there, and then you factor in the Soviet Union economically weakening, many of the Soviet Union's former satellite and allied nations across Europe began to break away from the Soviet Union. You started to have all sorts of independence movements occur in places like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Romania, etc. Yugoslavia was eventually, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But effectively, by 1990, you start to have all these former Soviet allied countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. They start to break away from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union just no longer had the clout. It had no longer had the power that it once did. And so all these revolutions occur throughout Eastern Europe. That Soviet bloc is no longer in power. And maybe the greatest visual demonstration of these rebellions took place in Berlin, where demonstrators and protesters from East and West Berlin collectively began to tear down the Berlin Wall, which, as we talked about in class, had always been the symbol of communist oppression and its shadow over Eastern Europe, especially the city of Berlin. So the rebellions that took place, some of which were mostly nonviolent. The Soviet Union didn't fight wars to try and keep these territories a part of their empire. Most of them broke away on their own. But this was just the ultimate sign of the Soviet Union's power collapse. And by 1991, the Soviet Union existed no more. It collapsed, and the Soviet Union shrunk back into what is today known as Russia, the Russian Federation. And so by 1991, all those former countries, 15 former countries under the Soviet Union's rule now were independent. And that included all those Central Asian Muslim states like of the Stans and many, many countries throughout Eastern Europe. But one country that I do have to do sort of a detour in is what happened in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a communist nation, although it was not allied very closely with the Soviet Union. However, beginning in 1991, with the fall of communism, many Yugoslavian countries began to break away. Nationalist movements led to the creation of new states. Now, Yugoslavia, geographically speaking, by the way, is right in the heart of the Balkans, as you can see on the map. But as a result of these countries forming, countries like Croatia, countries like Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Macedonia, Slovenia, there became a very serious and violent 4 to 5 year civil war that broke out in Yugoslavia. The respective countries that were once a part of this communist nation began to fight one another for territory and control as they broke away. Serbia, which was the military power of Yugoslavia, tried to exert its will and keep the other countries in line or in check. And Serbia, as a result, took a very hostile approach to the breakup of Yugoslavia. This led to ultimately the Serbians invading and carrying out acts of what the UN considered to be genocide throughout the Yugoslavian wars. The Serbs killed ethnic groups like Bosnian Muslims. They killed Croatians as well as a form of ethnic cleansing and genocide. This has been tracked and recorded as a modern-day example of genocide. Genocide, as we know, one of the first instances was the Armenian peoples, another group from the Balkans that were once under the control of the Ottoman Empire. But in Yugoslavia, during this Balkans war, there was another case of genocide, and it was not the only case of genocide, by the way, in the 1990s. There was also a genocide involving the African country of Rwanda, where one majority group was wiping out minority groups in Africa to cleanse their country of those groups. So you have two acts of genocide in the 1990s, which is just unfathomable to think about that wasn't that long ago, that we had major episodes of genocide. Ultimately, the Yugoslavian war would end with United States, but also United Nations intervention. The leader of Serbia was eventually found guilty of war crimes and executed for his role in the genocide of various peoples in the Yugoslavian war. So this is a bitter consequence of the devolution of communism in Eastern Europe. But with all things being taken into consideration, the fall of the Soviet Union was a relatively peaceful process, and it did not involve widespread bloodshed, and it did not involve a major war with the United States or other powers of the world. So when you consider that the Soviet Union's collapse came with relative little violence, it's quite interesting and fascinating that didn't happen on a more epic scale of violence. But by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that would leave only 5 countries left in the world with communist governments: China, Vietnam, Laos, which is a Southeast Asian country next to Vietnam, Cuba, and North Korea. Only 5 countries remained after the Soviet Union's collapse, and those are the 5 remaining communist countries today, which, as we've looked at the scope of communism all year long, we now know how communism both evolved and then eventually devolved. And so tomorrow, lots of opportunities for team trivia points, but we are going to finish up fundamentalism. I kept this longer than usual, so hopefully you guys all really locked into this, which could certainly be a great writing question of the AP exam or your comprehensive exam. So with that, I'm going to end things. Got it under 20 minutes. Got it under 20 minutes, which is always nice. So you guys know the drill by now. As always, the past shapes the future. Team trivia tomorrow. Let's go all in, baby. Take care. As always, the past shapes the future. Have a good night.